Good morning, everybody, and happy Friday. We're going to give everybody one more minute to get logged in, and then we'll get started. Right, it looks like the trickle of folks joining us has slowed down a little bit, so we can go ahead and get started. Welcome to our webinar this morning on improving interconnection to the electric grid in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. This is an initiative that's being led by the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, or EEA. My name is Josh Ryer. I'm Assistant Secretary of Energy here at EEA, and I'm joined today by my colleague Katie Gronendijk, who's a policy advisor for clean energy here at EEA as well. So what we're going to talk about today is this comprehensive initiative that EEA has been leading on behalf of the Healey-Driscoll administration to develop a comprehensive set of work streams that come together in a work plan that will urgently and comprehensively improve the interconnection of both new load and energy resources to the electric grid in 2025. The work that we've been compiling and prioritizing really can be categorized into four different buckets. The first is thinking about improvements that can be comprehensive and proactive to get out ahead of any interconnection issues that we've been experiencing in recent history in the future. So really those efforts are focused around proactive incorporation of public policies into grid planning efforts. And that includes the incorporation of policies related to economic development, the need for new housing in the Commonwealth, the deployment of clean energy resources, and of course, the electrification of transportation and buildings. It also includes a set of work that will address some of the near-term interconnection barriers that we're seeing, and those can kind of be categorized into two separate buckets. The first are barriers that are bubbling up from customers, and we're hearing directly from them about the barriers that they're experiencing, whether it's in the consumer experience with the interconnection process or in discrete technical or policy barriers that are inhibiting their ability to connect to the grid. There's also a bucket of changes that are being explored, and actually some that have already been proposed to the Department of Public Utilities that we'll talk about it in a little bit, that would address some near-term systemic and technical changes that will really help to unlock the deployment of clean energy at scale. And last but certainly not least, there's a bucket of work that's already going on at the Department of Public Utilities related to interconnection. And so, of course, we wanted to acknowledge that, incorporate that into the work that is included in this work plan. All of the work that we'll talk about today, and we'll get into more details on a lot of the different work streams that are incorporated into this work plan and that are a part of each one of those four buckets. The way that EEA has been going about effectuating this work plan is working directly with EEA agencies to develop the plan and execute on the plan. And then we've started to incorporate and engage with key stakeholders on the plans, and then through strategic engagement with the utilities to help implement learnings or other things that we see are barriers, and helping to address those urgently and comprehensively, as we mentioned earlier. Great, so that's what we're here to talk about today. The agenda for this webinar starts with a little bit of background on EEA, the electric system, and the interconnection action plan, which is what we're calling the work plan that I just described, and what's included in it. And then we'll do a deeper dive into the clean energy resource interconnection initiatives that we have as part of this work plan. And really, it's more of an overview of all the existing efforts and EEA coordination on those efforts to date. Then we'll also cover some newer initiatives related to load connection barriers and addressing those through partnership with stakeholders and the utilities. Then if we have time at the end, we're happy to take public comment and answer any questions that folks might have. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Katie.
Hey everyone. So first, I just wanted to introduce EEA to anyone who isn't sure of what EEA is in relation to the other state environmental and energy agencies. So EEA is a cabinet level office that oversees the state's 6 environmental, natural resource, and energy agencies. We're led by Secretary Rebecca Tepper. Our mission is to protect, preserve, and enhance the Commonwealth's environmental resources while ensuring a clean energy future for the state's residents. I work on the energy team at EEA alongside Assistant Secretary of Energy Josh Ryer and the Undersecretary of Energy Michael Judge. We also have teams at EEA that work on federal and regional energy affairs. We have an Office of Environmental Justice and Equity and an Office of Energy Transformation. And we all work very closely with the energy agencies at EEA, Department of Energy Resources, or DOER, which is focused on energy policy, planning, and programs. The Department of Public Utilities, which regulates the investor-owned electric and gas utilities, and the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, or MassCEC, which is a quasi-public agency focused on driving innovation for climate solutions. And we also work closely with EEA's environmental agencies, like the Department of Environmental Protection. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to give some quick background on the utilities in Massachusetts to set the stage for the rest of our presentation today. The 3 investor-owned electric utilities, National Grid, Eversource, and Unitil, serve about 90% of electric customers in the state. But when we refer to electric distribution companies, or EDCs later on, this is who we're referring to. These utilities are regulated by the Department of Public Utilities. 41 municipal light plants serve the other 10% of electric customers in Massachusetts, and these are run by the municipality itself. This map here to the right shows the territory of the EDCs and MOPs, and you can find it on DPU's website. Next slide. So as you all know, Massachusetts is a national leader in addressing climate change, and we have some pretty ambitious emissions reduction requirements. Massachusetts is required by law to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, or in other words, to reduce statewide gross GHG emissions by at least 85% below 1990 levels and sequester or store the rest. EEA was also required to set interim limits. So for 2030, we're required to reduce emissions by at least 50% below 1990 levels. And we were also required to set some sub-limits for 6 sectors of the economy, which are listed here. So we lay out our strategy for achieving these limits in our clean energy and climate plans. These figures on the right are from the Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2050, and they show the changes that may need to be made in certain sectors to achieve those emissions reductions. The electrification of transportation buildings, along with the changes needed to the power sector to enable 97% of electricity to be sourced from clean energy, along with the significant increase in load that you can see there, will require big changes to the electric grid. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Josh.
Great. And so, yeah, I think the other really important piece to understand as we transition to talking about interconnection is just the evolution of the electric grid. Today's grid, and maybe that's it's more accurate to say yesterday's grid, really had a one-way flow of power from power generation to transmission through distribution lines and through onto the end customer. That was really focused on centralized generation and utilizing large assets to capture the economies of scale that come along with that. Today's grid is increasingly moving towards what we see on the bottom of this slide, which is a very dynamic grid that both has two-way power flows, but also has generation sources that are not only smaller, but closer to where load actually is. And as we note in the text on the left here, we're likely to see in this future grid electric load that grows by at least 50% or close to 50% through 2035. And there's actually estimates through 2050 that show that load might actually double through that period. So all of that to say there's an increase of load due to electrification, data centers, other demands on the grid, while there's also an increasing amount of distributed energy resources combines to make a much more dynamic and complicated grid today and into the future. And then as kind of a last background question and level setting topic, we wanted to make sure everyone on the call understands what we're talking about when we say interconnection. We're really talking about two different things. The first one, interconnection, the actual term, refers to the connection of new energy resources like solar or battery storage to the electric grid, either the transmission or distribution grid. New load connections, however, refer to connecting or plugging in a new source of electric load, like new construction or EV chargers, to the distribution grid and sometimes also to the transmission grid. And this distinction is really important because new energy resources are actually putting power onto the grid, whereas, of course, new load is consuming additional power. And those bring different challenges for the grid operators and the utilities. So why interconnection? Why is this something that EEA has taken on as a priority initiative for the Secretariat in 2025? Well, first thinking about interconnection of distributed energy resources, existing barriers to that inhibit our ability to deploy clean energy resources at scale and on the time frame necessary to achieve our statutory climate requirements. And it is important to be reminded of the fact that our climate goals are not just goals, but rather statutory requirements. And it also weakens our competitiveness against other states that are able to deploy these resources more quickly. We also see on the capacity side of things, or the new load connection side of things, that customers often can't plug into the grid due to a lack of grid capacity and face a long and complex and sometimes expensive interconnection process, which then can also lead to delays and unfortunately sometimes projects not moving forward because of those complexities, because the interconnection timeline does not match up with the development timeline. So it is really important to note, however, that some of the insufficient grid capacity or a lack of transformers or a complex interconnection process are sometimes outside the control of what we do today. And so that's where we're really trying to think about how can we think differently moving forward to address these issues. Great. And so what we did internally at EEA is we compiled and we looked at all of the different work streams that we have currently ongoing to address the issues that we're seeing with interconnection so that we can unlock the potential of distributed energy resources and new load and to avoid any extra costs or inefficiencies that might come with not actually addressing these barriers. So this interconnection action plan is a comprehensive set of actions and that are both already underway and new actions for us to comprehensively look at and address these barriers and to make changes in hopefully 2025. So this shows kind of the time frame, or at least how we're thinking about the process of implementing or effectuating the interconnection action plan. So it's starting with engaging with customers on grid connection barriers. We've done that already in a few ways where folks have come to us and we've had conversations. Now we're starting the phase where we'll be proactively reaching out to customers to better understand their experiences. We'll then take that information to improve to work with the utilities to improve the customer experience and the availability of resources, working on ways to make the process more efficient. And then also thinking about, as I mentioned earlier, whether or not thinking about and identifying really whether or not there are substantive and policy barriers that are truly inhibiting our ability to meet our clean energy goals and our goals in driving new economic development and building of housing in the Commonwealth, and whether or not how we can solve those problems together to remove those barriers. And then ultimately, as I mentioned at the start, really we not only want to triage things in the near term, but think about how all these things come together and how we can create solutions to create systems that will have a long-term impact so that we don't actually keep running into interconnection barriers. Great. So that's context, that's big picture on what we're trying to accomplish here. Now I want to dive into some of the more of the specifics on the different work streams that EA and EA agencies, and often it's the EA agencies that are really leading the charge and doing the hard work on all of these initiatives. For the most part, again, as I mentioned, the clean energy interconnection initiatives that we have are largely leveraging existing working groups and existing work streams to really push forward for changes that will help unlock the potential of clean energy in Massachusetts. So folks on this call probably already know, may already know, that energy projects, in order to interconnect to the system, have to go through a DPU approved interconnection process if you're connecting to the distribution grid. Of course, that process is something that's administered by the electric utilities. And if you're interconnecting to the transmission system, you have to go through an ISO New England approved process that's administered by, well, at least in part, by the transmission companies or owners. And so we want to, really importantly, at the bottom, you can see, so there's a very specific process for transmission interconnections that you can find out more about it in ISO's open access tariff. But for the distribution utilities, the process to interconnect can be found in the standards of interconnection for distributed energy tariffs. And the process generally it can be separated into the three parts that you can see at the bottom. You submit your application, it's deemed completed. Then for standard and expedited processes, so there's three different processes for distributed generation interconnections. The simplified process is essentially for smaller facilities, generally speaking, solar facilities that are below 25 kilowatts. For projects that go through the expedited or standard process, they will have a distribution system impact study. And there's also the possibility that they'll have to do an ASO study, which is an affected system operator study, which would look at the potential transmission impacts of that facility. And then at that point, there's an interconnection agreement that is issued with a cost estimate and then a construction timeline for any interconnection or grid infrastructure upgrades that are needed to actually be built out. Great. So to talk specifically about the interconnection barriers for distributed energy resources, we've already mentioned some of the impacts, but we know, and again, a lot of the folks on the line today probably already know that there are projects that are waiting in a queue throughout at different places throughout the Commonwealth, just waiting for the ability to connect to the grid to move forward with their projects. That paired with the complex and often long interconnection process, and also the traditional cost allocation methodology for grid upgrades, whereby an interconnection cost is paid by the last customer to trigger it, can make it so that projects are simply uneconomical to move forward. And we'll talk about it in a second. There's already been reforms to try to address that, and there's more in the works. And so that can really, as we mentioned before, inhibit Massachusetts' ability to actually deploy clean energy at the the pace and scale that's needed to meet our climate goals. And, and it's really important now that we address these interconnection barriers so that we're able to build on the success of last year's Climate Act, which, as folks hopefully are familiar, know that it authorized sweeping reforms to the siting and permitting process here in the Commonwealth to enable us to site and permit clean energy resources, among other resources, more quickly. In order to enable the full potential of those reforms, we of course need the grid capacity and the interconnection processes in order to actually connect these resources to the grid. On the right, you can see kind of how we conceptually think about the fundamental barriers to connecting grid resources. Really, it's the first order problems are connecting. You can't plug in because there's not enough capacity. And then also that the process sometimes is overly complex or long or opaque. And that can then result in it being too expensive. And the combination of all three of those things then results in project delays or the cancellation of projects. So we want to talk a little bit about, I mentioned at the top of the webinar that really the ideal end state is to have processes in place that enable the Commonwealth to get out ahead of interconnection issues and to have sufficient grid capacity so that we're not running into backlogs and friction points when trying to interconnect resources. So the Commonwealth has been trying to address this issue and continues to look for ways to address this issue on a number of fronts. The first one is called the Capital Investment Projects, or it's the provisional program that the Department of Public Utilities authorized several years ago and it actually expanded and allowed to continue in the recent electric sector modernization plan orders. And this allows for grid investments in certain areas to look at multiple projects and then build out those projects and allocate costs for those new upgrades to all of the projects that are looking to benefit from those grid upgrades. So really addressing the cost allocation problem that I highlighted earlier. We then also have electric sector modernization plans, or ESMPs, and those were filed, I think it was this time last year, or earlier, it was in January of last year with DPU. And those are filed and required to be filed by statute every 5 years. And really, it's intended to have the utilities look forward and see what are all the grid investments that are needed in grid modernizations that are needed to enable the state's decarbonization or climate goals. And so really these last ones focused on incremental load and making sure that a grid capacity is planned for and built out to meet the expected incremental demand. Then more recently, and actually as part of the Department of Public Utilities order approving the ESMPs, they set up this long-term system planning proposal process that was actually in the utilities proposal that was submitted with stakeholders last Friday would really look at establishing a process to complement the ESMPs that would focus on proactively building out grid infrastructure to enable the deployment of clean energy resources. So really, it would replace the SIPs long term once it's in place. And then last but not least is the EV charging grid planning process that was also authorized as part of the 2024 Climate Act. It's specifically Section 103. It enables the Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Coordinating Council, or EVIC, which I also chair, to work with the utilities, work with DOER, work with the Massachusetts Department of Transportation to really look at what are the needs of the Commonwealth for the next 10 years to really meet our EV charging goals and to unlock the potential of electric vehicles, and then to work with those same stakeholders to identify areas on the grid where we need to really deploy or have the best opportunities for deploying fast chargers and medium and heavy duty charging fleets or chargers for medium heavy duty fleets, and to work with the utilities on whether or not there is a need for additional build out of the grid to meet those needs. Great. So I'm not going to go too much more into the ESMPs because I mentioned kind of the broad brushstrokes of what's included and the importance of these to really get out ahead of and to project forward the needs for the system in order to accommodate our climate goals here in Massachusetts. I will just note that there are several things that are enumerated in 92B, section 92B of chapter 164 of the general laws that the utilities have to look at and include in these plans. And it includes energy storage and electrification technologies, as well as transmission upgrades. And the status in these slides will be put on the website that we've created for this initiative. It includes specific dates on when the DPU approved these plans. The very last thing I will note, and it's really important to highlight, is the role of the Grid Modernization Advisory Council, or GMAC, which is chaired by DOER. And they are really the stakeholder engagement forum to help work with the utilities and provide feedback on these plans before they go to DPU. So a lot of work was done a year and a half or so ago to provide input to the utilities on an early draft of the ESMPs before they got to DPU. So I already mentioned earlier this long-term system planning process that's really, at least as proposed, would build out and would strategically develop every 5 years a plan to proactively build out the grid to accommodate projections of distributed generation. That plan was filed on May 9th with the Department of Public Utilities, as I mentioned. And I do think it is really important to highlight there's general consensus on the proposal, but some of the concerns that were highlighted with the proposal is the fact that there is now kind of this additional process looking at the build out of the grid for specific resources that's not looked at holistically with other distribution system planning documents. And so that's something that we're hoping that DPU and others will look at and think about long-term, how all of these things can come together. And actually, as I'll mention later, there's provisions that were included in the Energy Affordability, Independence and Innovation Act that would actually direct the DPU to accomplish just that. And maybe the one last thing I'll say on the LTSPP is I just want to note the docket number is DPU 2520. And there will be additional process and time for folks to look at those proceedings. And we'd really encourage folks that were involved in that process, and also C&I customers and other load customers that maybe weren't a part of the LTSPP working group, to engage in that process at the Department of Public Utilities. One of the things that was highlighted by DPU, or by DOER rather, as part of the LTSPP, and something that they and other stakeholders are hoping to explore more, is flexible interconnection and making sure that that's incorporated into distribution system planning moving forward. For folks that aren't familiar, EEA views flexible interconnection as kind of a no regrets solution to help unlock and to deploy more clean energy resources on the grid. It allows customers essentially to agree to a set of parameters or programs that would minimize their impact on the grid, and thus enable the deployment of those resources without the need to build out additional grid capacity, and thus for the resource to pay for that additional capacity. The kind of ideal end state for flexible interconnection is this very dynamic form of interconnection that will be unlocked once the utilities have their distribution or distributed energy resource management systems, there we go, or DERMS, in place, and they're able to dynamically control third-party devices to ensure that they don't impact certain assets. And that will give them, really, it will give them and the resources the most flexibility in being able to meet, to provide power to the grid without impacting existing resources and the grid infrastructure. So this is something that we're working with DOER and the industry to see how we can advance this. My understanding is that the Interconnection Implementation Review Group will be exploring this, and certainly, as I'll mention earlier, there is proposed legislation on this as well. Okay, I'm just going to touch on the EV charging infrastructure planning process very briefly. I mentioned already that it will be a forecast of for the next 10 years of the EV charging load that the Commonwealth expects. That forecast will be detailed in the Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Coordinating Council, or EVIC, assessment that's due to the legislature in August of this year. I will note that this, of course, does not fall into the bucket of a resource, at least typically, that provides power back onto the grid, but we did think it was important to include it as part of this discussion and section of the presentation, as it's another grid planning effort that we're hoping to find ways to merge together in the future. So I just mentioned the Interconnection Implementation Review Group. That is a group that's been stood up by the Department of Public Utilities to really look at interconnection processes, and this is where the systemic near-term changes that I mentioned earlier, really for the most part, where they would be made and would be looked at. And DOER is an active member in that group, and as part of this, the work plan that we had put together and we started developing in late 2024, we really identified the need for DOER and for others to actively engage in this process to make sure that a filing that would provide improvements to the process was made. And I'm happy to report, and folks on the line probably know, that a filing was made on March 25th that updated both the simplified and expedited tariffs to hopefully unlock the potential of more clean energy resources. And then a big one on that front is that it would also allow, what was filed would also allow projects stuck behind group studies to move forward where there's an existing capacity, which is something that EEA had heard about frequently for the last several years. And I'll also mention one idea that EEA is a strong proponent of that was highlighted in the filing, but no specific proposals were included, was thinking about socializing or finding a way for other DER program participants to share the cost of residential transformer upgrades. For folks that work on residential solar, you'll know that if you trigger that upgrade, that can be $5,000 to $10,000. That can make or break a project, and is really caused by the kind of culmination of other projects that have been deployed, as well as in other projects that are deployed after that will benefit from it. So we really think from a policy perspective, it might make more sense to actually socialize those transformer costs amongst other solar customers. We also want to highlight there's a number of great efforts that are being led by our federal and regional energy affairs team related to this. They've been working with the EEA agencies to identify areas where distribution and transmission planning coordination could be improved. They've also led and really got ahead of FERC Order 1920 in leading kind of this phase 2 transmission procurement, working with the other New England states to agree to a process whereby a policy-driven transmission needs can be studied, and then an RFP to meet those needs can be issued. And we're happy to report that at the end of March of this year, ISO New England actually issued the first RFP out of that process. So really leading the way on proactive transmission planning as well. And then back to the kind of ASO study process in conversation, FERC Order number 2023 is something that we're actively following. FERC approved with modifications the ISO New England's compliance on that. And the FRIA team is working with industry and ISO New England to really make sure that that's implemented in a way that makes the most sense for the deployment of clean energy resources and also on the related ASO study processes. So this is a summary of all of the different work streams related to clean energy interconnection efforts that we have going on, that we're actively prioritizing. And then before we get to the new load connection portion of this, I just wanted to highlight several provisions of the Energy Affordability, Independence, and Innovation Act, which was filed with the General Court on Tuesday. It's listed as HD 4707. That bill included a number of provisions that are related to the interconnection of distributed energy resources. The few I want to highlight very quickly here is long-term distribution system planning. Again, asking DPU to find a way to consolidate and moving forward, really coordinate all of the different distribution system planning and cost recovery frameworks. We also are proposing some comprehensive load management and virtual power plant plans to be included within the ESMPs moving forward, the electric sector modernization plans. There's also a provision that would require the utilities to set up flexible interconnection programs. There's also a provision that would allow for critical facility microgrids that are owned by government entities to operate in the public right-of-way. And then there's several other provisions that relate to clean energy resources that I won't go into, but for the sake of completeness are listed here. Great. And so with that, I want to turn to our load connection initiatives and addressing the constraints with those processes. And for that, I'll turn it over to Katie to kick us off.
Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit about the connection of load to the electric grid and some of the new efforts we have to improve these processes. So the reason that we're focused on this issue is because we've been receiving at various state agencies, including EEA, DPU, Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, increasing numbers of complaints about grid capacity issues and the grid connection process from new load customers like businesses and housing developments. We've seen that the process for connecting new customer load to the grid can be a barrier to economic and housing development, including the timeframes for connecting new load and for making necessary grid upgrades. And looking forward, as we said before, electric load is expected to grow by 50% by 2035, meaning that the time to address any barriers to connecting new load is now. Next slide, please. So this is the general connection process for large load customers for the 3 EDCs in Massachusetts. It does vary by company, but this is generally how it works. So first, large load customers can contact the utility prior to submitting a work order to determine whether their project is feasible and if upgrades will be needed. Eversource will also give a cost estimate at this point. For National Grid, this step is called Step 0. So this should happen as early on in the customer's process as possible. Secondly, the formal process starts with the submission of a work order. The project would then be sent to either engineering or design for review, depending on the size of the load. And if it has to be sent to engineering first, it can add more time. Utility would then finalize the design with the customer, then move into the pre-construction phase, in which the scope of work is finalized, all needed local approvals and permits are obtained, and the customer provides any payment needed in full. Then the construction phase starts, which is when the utility completes construction and energizes the customer and installs a meter. There's sometimes delays in this step due to external factors like the current transformer shortage. The amount of time this process takes varies widely based on the type and size of the project, and there are a number of steps in this process that require action from the customer as well. On average, the whole process takes about 40 weeks, but it can vary depending on the project from 2 weeks to a few years. Back to you, Josh.
Great, thanks, Katie. And before we get into some of the initiatives that we plan to move forward on in other initiatives that we already set up, we wanted to highlight a few really important considerations for folks that work with new business developments, new housing developments, EV chargers, important considerations that have already been made very clear to us in our informal engagement with folks through complaints or discussions on the interconnection process for a new load that are really important for people to know about. So the first one is that it's vital in any development of a major project, including EV charging, to really engage with your utility early in the project development cycle to understand the available grid capacity. As we'll talk about in a little bit, we're also working on making sure it's easier to get that information and to understand the steps that Katie just went through and what's required of everyone. But really, we can't say it enough how important it is for folks that are looking to connect to the grid eventually to go to their utilities first to make sure that there is in fact grid capacity. If there's not, if there is a creative solution that might be available to help connect your project. It's also vitally important for you to submit a formal work order, a connection request, as soon as possible in the process. That gets things started on the utility side of things. And then paired with that, this third bullet, it's really important to work towards the payment steps that are included in as part of the interconnection process. That's really when you're kind of officially in the process in the system, and when your position in the queue to be able to be connected is held. And so it's really important for folks to realize that that's kind of the step to get to hold your spot, and to work towards that as quickly as possible to make sure that your planning is taken into account on the distribution company side of things. And then we do just want to highlight that the transformer supply chains are highly constrained currently, and they're causing significant delays. Even when transformers are proactively purchased, there still can be some significant delays and changes to timeframes, which that uncertainty, of course, is not ideal, but is unfortunately the reality currently. So the first thing that we want to highlight is that, and again, what was clear in the customer interactions that we've been a part of or seen, and the customers that we've spoken with that have run into interconnection barriers over the past 6-9 months, is really that a focus on improving the customer experience and the resources that are available to customers, and not just resources being available, but being easily accessible in language that is accessible for everyone, is really a vital barrier for everyone in this process on all sides of things, including our end and the utilities. And so we've started to engage with the utilities on a monthly basis to develop resources and to make improvements to this process, where the state can help and to coordinate with the utilities on any improvements that they're making. And so, as I already mentioned, that this includes the development of new resources, establishing processes to identify new projects that are under development, which we'll talk about more, and then just coordinating with the utilities on their approaches and seeing if we can get them to at least be as aligned as possible, and where there's differences, help to educate the public about those differences so everyone knows what they're dealing with in the different service territories. We're about to walk through a few different projects and ideas on this collaboration that we're starting to explore with the utilities. I want to be very clear that these are simply ideas that we've started to work on together. Nothing is final. In fact, one of the reasons we want to share them with you today is to get feedback from folks to make sure that these proposed initiatives and work really resonate with what folks think is needed to address the barriers for new load connections substantially. So the first, so I mentioned focusing on developing additional customer resources. One of the things that we're thinking about providing and working with the utilities on is a centralized way for folks to get information on the new load connection process. For folks that are familiar with EV charging, you'll know that the Mass Clean Energy Center is currently working on kind of a place that all customers can go to get information on EV charging programs, which is also a complex landscape. So this is a similar idea. Also working on developing new resources. This on the right here is a resource that Eversource has created to help customers understand the steps in the interconnection process. This is a resource that I personally find helpful in developing across all of the utilities and working with the utilities on developing information like this that we can share with all customers to help engage with them to understand and unpack kind of the complexities of the process is something that we're thinking about. We're also thinking about whether or not it makes sense to hold more webinars like this to understand what the state is working on, more webinars to understand the process. I understand that Eversource recently held one with developers. So thinking through whether or not it's useful to provide more of those resources. And then, as Katie mentioned, there is a step zero process that National Grid has available to customers. There is something similar with the other companies, but really unpacking the value of that, making sure customers know about it, and focusing on providing that early assessment to help customers understand what capacity is available and when on the grid. I also mentioned a process for identifying new developments. And certainly, particularly on this front, we welcome all ideas on how to effectuate this. But we're working on the fact that as much as I put out a call for anyone that's working on a new project to make sure that you engage with the utilities early and often to identify any grid constraints, it's not always possible to do that early, and not everyone's gonna we're not going to be able to make sure that everyone has that information and know that they need to go to the utilities ahead of time. So how can we put systems in place that make sure that if a developer or other party doesn't think or doesn't know to go to the utility, that information already gets to the utilities regardless, and they have the ability to assess whether or not there's grid capacity, and if needed, proactively reach out to the customer. So we're thinking about, and we've started to engage with our counterparts in other state agencies, as well as municipalities, to think about, again, systems that we can put in place and hopefully automatic or automized processes that kind of provide that information to the utilities as soon as a new project is known about, not only so that they have the information as early as possible, but to also reduce the administrative burden on folks in local planning departments and elsewhere that already have a ton on their plates, and we're not adding another thing to that. We're also planning in the coming months to stand up some what we're calling focus groups with large load customers to make sure that we understand the barriers that they're facing in the interconnection process, not only to understand what resources, what improvements could be made to enhance the customer experience and understanding of the process, but also to help us understand if there are currently policy and technical barriers that are part of the interconnection process, and then to be able to take that back to the utilities. So we've already started actively planning some of these focus groups with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, or MAPC, which focuses on kind of the Boston metro area. We're also in active conversations with Mass Housing and other state agencies and relevant stakeholders working on affordable housing to stand up focus groups to really dive into what affordable housing is experiencing and what the state can expect the housing growth to look like due to the MBTA Communities Act. And then we're also already working with and actively reaching out to other regional planning agencies like MAPC to set up these similar focus groups. So when we have more information about the date and time of those and the kind of the groups and the type of businesses and developments that we're hoping to have as part of each of those focus groups, we'll put more information on the website that hopefully everyone had access to and saw in the invitation for this webinar. So I already mentioned earlier that we have monthly meetings with the utilities to help to address and improve the customer experience. We're also using that time together to really dig into the interconnection process, understand the policy implications, the differences between the companies, and using that as a starting point to understand, how we can help use that information to better explain those systems, how the state can help, what the utilities can do, and also whether or not there are any improvements or changes that we collectively think would help address a lot of the concerns that we've already heard. I also want to mention that as part of kind of our internal effort, this action plan that we put together, we identified that creating a sustainable economic development kind of areas, or focus zones, development zones. There we go. That's the right term. Would help us get ahead of to the ultimate goal of getting ahead of interconnection issues in the future. So we're not triaging these things, not focused on just improving the processes to get individual projects online, but rather getting out ahead of the problem. We identified the need for, in partnership with the Office of Energy Transformation, to stand up a group to look at creating these sustainable economic development zones whereby we could direct economic activity, whether it's new businesses like climate tech or advanced manufacturing, and also housing to those areas. So this could be both directing them to areas that have existing capacity, but also working with the utilities on potentially strategically building out the grid in those areas. So if anyone is interested in that effort, we'd encourage you to go to the link that'll be in the slides, and to sign up for that working group. The other thing that's worth highlighting as part of this effort is the state is starting to take on projections of what electrification, policy-driven electrification, will actually result in. So by that I mean both low transportation electrification and building electrification, looking at what our state policies on both those fronts are likely to see in terms of new load on the grid through 2030 and 2035. And using that, the utilities already do very similar efforts. In fact, in many instances, they have very detailed analyses on future EVs, for example, and EV chargers. But this would be an effort for the state to really build on its own forecasts for the clean energy and compliance plans, or climate plans rather, and to really provide more substantial direction and granular direction on how we see load materializing based on those requirements. So that's something that you can expect to see over the next couple of years, and something we would use to engage with the utilities. So here's a summary of all of the work that we just walked through. There's a bucket of collaborations with the utilities. There's a bucket of state-led efforts to really try and, again, get out ahead of these new load interconnection issues on the state-led efforts side of things. And then the collaborations with the utilities, really working on nearer term solutions and making the interconnection process easier for customers. And then recognizing that we're almost at time here, I want to flag the fact that there are, again, a few sections within the Energy Affordability, Independence, and Innovation Act that are would address this problem as well. Again, the long-term distribution system planning direction to the DPU to combine all these things would also help make sure that all of the distribution system planning efforts that the utilities take on and that the DPU reviews includes housing and economic development and other load growth. It also specifically updates the requirements, or would, if adopted, update the requirements of the electric sector modernization plans, and would require both housing and economic development to be included in the ESMPs. And it would also require the utilities to coordinate with relevant stakeholders and state agencies in developing and integrating those considerations. And also, if adopted, the Energy Affordability and Independence Act would codify the Sustainable Economic Development Working Group that I mentioned and would allow for DPU to consider any recommendations out of those working groups. There's several other provisions that are that might be relevant or of interest to folks, including submetering for housing, on-bill financing of clean energy and building efficiency of investments in utility-owned heat loops, and other provisions that hopefully would unlock the potential of geothermal. Again, listing that for completeness, as they're not maybe directly related to interconnection. So with that, we want to say we hope you stay involved. Certainly, we anticipate speaking with many of you on this topic. We, as I mentioned earlier, we'll post anything about these focus groups and the ones that are open to the public on the website. We also want to mention that our colleagues at DOER, who run the Grid Modernization Advisory Council, as I mentioned earlier, they're really the ones that bring together stakeholders and help inform the SMPs. They will be convening municipal stakeholders in July. So certainly we while interconnection won't necessarily be the topic of the day at that, we certainly wouldn't be surprised if it comes up. And so we would encourage you, if you're interested, to join that event. And with that, I know we're at time. I don't know. I think there's a number of questions in the chat. What we can do is we will post this, and we will post the slides. As hopefully folks saw Katie's response. We are unfortunately at time, but maybe what we can do is open it up for one or